Hello, and welcome to the Rental Histories Tour, which is taking place on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in so-called Brunswick. Find your way to Jewel Station to get started. Together we'll explore the histories of renters, a class of people differentiated from homeowners and landlords in that they have to pay to stay in the places they live or face eviction. Even as some pay their landlord's mortgage several times over, a key feature of renting is that only the temporary use of a space is purchased, rather than the commodity itself. In other words, renters are the non-owning class. But land ownership is an imported idea, a colonial construct used to deny Aboriginal sovereignty. Land ownership is written into settler law, enforced by our institutions of violence, the police, the courts, the prisons, and serves as the basis to First Nations subjugation. In settler contexts, land ownership is code word for land theft. In evoking these stories, I acknowledge that neither tenants nor homeowners or landlords of settler descent hold any valid claim to this land that is stolen. While the perceived relation between them has very real consequences, their existence as the propertied and the propertyless depends on an illegitimate legal system, implemented through ongoing policies of attempted genocide. Sovereignty belongs to the Wurundjeri people. Always was, always will be. Now from Jewel Station, head south, keeping east of the tracks. Then make your way towards Sydney Road along Barclay Street. I'll meet you there. At the turn of the 20th century, Brunswick became home to Victoria's first workers' housing estates under the Closer Settlement Act, which sought to house the expanding industrial working class. Proximity to shops, services and workplaces, or a tram that could get you there cheaply, meant Brunswick was ideal for workers and their families. Industrialisation steadily drew rural folk and returned service people to the ever-increasing stock of urban factories. Many of the new residents settled in the inner suburbs where rents, though high, were made affordable by subletting and subdividing. The population was only crammed in harder when some residential areas were demolished to make way for more factories. The Housing Investigation and Slum Abolition Board described the extent of the overcrowding, having inspected one area with 49 houses to the acre. Throughout the 20s, middle and upper classes enjoyed economic prosperity, and in many cases, home ownership. But for the Brunswick working class, the 20s weren't easy. With 87% renting and over 300 factories, the value of their labour was extracted first by bosses and again by landlords. Little remained for the bare essentials: food, medicine, clothing, education, and leisure. But if the 20s weren't easy, the 30s were hard. After the Christmas of 29, about a third of local factories just didn't open up. This marked the beginning of the Great Depression for Brunswick folks who experienced higher rates of unemployment than most. With the initial absence of government relief, many of the unemployed and their families fell behind in rent. The threat of eviction loomed large, with over 11,000 warrants of ejectment issued across Melbourne in the first and worst 3 years. But the Brunswick unemployed didn't just cop it. Organised resistance took off in July 1930 with the establishment of anti-eviction committees under the newly formed Brunswick Unemployed Association. Historian Charlie Fox reckoned that without them, things would have taken a very serious turn in Brunswick. These committees mobilised tens, hundreds, or even thousands to eviction sites to physically defend homes, eject bailiffs, return seized furniture, and make any landlord think twice. The unemployed were a force to be reckoned with. In June 1931, 200 of them marched from an unemployed camp in Broadmeadows down Sydney Road to the Proletarian Hall on Lydia Street. After staying the night, they were helped by local communists to identify and occupy 3 empty terrace houses on this street, Barclay Street. With rent paid by the Brunswick Workers' International Relief Committee, they lived collectively by sharing domestic labour and pulling their dole tickets. The 200 men of the Barclay Street commune were remembered as a tremendous force in the anti-eviction struggles. Now take a left on Sydney Road and head to the town hall. Mass physical defence wasn't the only tactic used to resist evictions. In most cases, people would simply move on before it came to that. Families performed moonlight flits by packing up and relocating in the dead of night, often changing their names to avoid rental debts. Meetings were held here at the Brunswick Town Hall to debate the need for a rent moratorium. One attendee argued that there were many owing rent in Brunswick who wished to remain in their homes, but they would knuckle down later and by dint of hard work pay off the arrears. But no such bill was ever successful. Others used theatrical protests to stay in their home. Let's hear from Tom Hills, an unemployed activist who took part in a stunt here at Town Hall.
For instance, out at Brunswick, we were at our full Labour council out of Brunswick. There was a Scotsman in the early part was evicted there, and the cable trams was in existence there. They would not do anything to help this family who were evicted. I think there was 3 children, man and wife, a Scotch family, I remember. So what we done, we got all their furniture and we set it out like you've set out this room where you're on the tram tracks. We put the table up, the chairs there, got some bread and things, and they were having dinner there in the middle of the day. Well, there's bloody hundreds of people around. Outside the Brunswick Town Hall was. They bloody soon done something about that. They found a mouse. Those were the kind of things we used to do, you see.
Attempts to keep people in their homes weren't always successful, sometimes only delaying the inevitable. This didn't stop the organised unemployed. With families turned out on the street, they would return to the empty house and strip it for firewood, removing chimneys and pulling down walls. As Tom recalled, the owner would eventually come and all he'd have was a block of land. These widely publicised fierce actions ultimately won them the rent dole in 1932, providing evicted tenants with a substantial 8 shillings a week. Now find your way to Gregory Street, about 15 minutes north. Brunswick women had a variety of roles during the 30s. Public and private, paid and unpaid. Women were the first to be put off or receive wage cuts from their jobs in the textile, rope, cord and service industries. Many recall their mothers staying up late doing piecework from home. Families depended on traditional women's skills to survive. Working class women were experts at making do, with usually no more than a backyard tap and a kerosene tin over an open fire. Women's experiences cannot be reduced to a single narrative. They experienced unemployment, homelessness, and poverty just as they experienced neighbourliness, achievement, and pride in their homes and communities. Some faced eviction from so-called slum houses, while others were slumlords themselves. We'll now hear from Nelly Thompson, who made arrangements with her landlord to get through rental hardship here on Gregory Street.
When I had to go in and see him, I thought, inside nearly went out the toes of my shoe. Anyway, he said, and what's your trouble, madam? I said, I don't see how we're going to pay any rent just yet a while. And he said, is this your boy? I said, yes, that's the oldest one. No work? I said, no. Well, he said, pay whatever you can when you can. But he said, never ignore our notices. If you just ignore our notices, it's not so good for you. But that was all right, because you see, when things got up a bit, we paid extra onto our monthly rent until we caught up with that arrears. And that's all I had to do.
You were very lucky.
Well, I just couldn't see any point in just dodging along from one month to the next, not knowing whether I'd be out in the street or not.
Continue west along Hope Street, then ride on Westbourne and head north. I'll meet you at 74 Rose Street. With the days of eviction fights over by the mid-30s, a more respectable form of housing activism emerged. The Brunswick-born Christian socialist Frederick Oswald Barnett founded the Slum Study Group in 1934. A major voice of the slum abolition movement, the group conducted research on working-class suburbs, which they defined as slums. Poor, congested, dilapidated, and populated by slum dwellers. They estimated about 5% suffered from so-called slum-mindedness, which they attributed to morality, criminality, alcohol consumption, laziness, and bad parenting. Barnett argued that housing was a health issue and a human right. Their first report in 1936 summed up, "The problem of the slums is essentially the problem of poverty." The group formed coalitions with other middle-class organisations, taking a paternalistic, scientific, and lobbyist approach. After surveying every street, lane, and slum pocket in a 5k radius of the Melbourne GPO, they declared just 13% of homes fit for human habitation, with a substantial number incapable of repair. A quarter lacked bathroom facilities, and most didn't have a kitchen sink. Rentals for uninhabitable houses were disproportionately high, at 11 shillings and 2 pence a week, clearly unaffordable for the 4,000 families evicted for non-payment each year. Barnett envisioned housing as a state social service, where rent varied not according to the type of house, but according to tenants' capacity to pay. Soon after they published a controversial list of the names and addresses of Melbourne's slumlords, the state government passed the Housing Act of 1937, which gave provision to establish the Victorian Housing Commission. This was a huge win for Barnett's group of slum abolitionists, who gained legal powers to order demolitions and build replacement housing according to their own standards. But the Commission's goals were cast aside in 1938 with the outbreak of World War II. After a decade of near-absent housing construction during the Depression, Melbourne's building industry again came to a halt. The Commission took this opportunity to assess Victoria's housing needs, something to the tune of 83,000 dwellings, and plan for the peace we fight for. Emergency war provisions were passed in 1940 to protect tenants, including limited evictions, rent controls, and rent boards to determine fair rental value. But many landlords preferred their properties empty than fixed unprofitably. In 1945, with the post-war influx of returned service people, migrants and refugees, the extent of the housing crisis became apparent. Some veterans took inspiration from the vigilantes movement in the UK, which saw mass squatting actions. It only took a few highly publicised squats and a single threat to seize all empty houses in Melbourne to force the Victorian government to announce new requisitioning laws within the week, empowering councils to install tenants in empty houses and guarantee their rent. Still, most were forced to crowd in with relatives or find other arrangements. Emergency camps were set up, lasting well into the 50s. Children slept on verandas, families lived in single rooms, garages, or tents. One English migrant, Olive York, remembers the migrant boarding house she rented at 74 Rose Street with her husband and son.
But we did go to another place run by a Mrs. Simkus, and that it was in West Brunswick, Rose Street, West Brunswick, and it was called the Warren because they housed people like rabbits. One family to every room. There are about 6 rooms, and she had a family in every room, and she charged them up very well. You know, most of my wages went in paying the rent there. And also we had to pay a shilling to use the copper, a shilling to use the oven, and a shilling for this, a shilling for that. Again, the toilet used to be blocked up and it didn't work. It was a most uncomfortable way of life, and I knew I wasn't going to stay there long.
Head back to Albion and walk west until you hit Kitchener Street. And press play when you get there. Post-war reconstruction was a major priority under Curtin's Labour government. Many feared the post-war chaos of World War I, when soldiers returned to poverty and precarity. With the post-war housing crisis in full swing, the Housing Commission quickly forgot about its early aims for slum abolition. Better to live in a slum, they said, and provide a home for those who didn't have one. They did manage to produce a few commission homes in the early days of the war, before labour and materials were restricted to the war effort. In 1939, the first public housing estates were erected at Fisherman's Bend, Preston and Brunswick West, here on Kitchener Street. Known as the Kitchener Estate, 22 houses were let to low-income families at economic rents. The Commission responded to complaints of social frictions at the estate with the deployment of female housing officers. These friendly or intrusive rent collectors were to be unfailingly just and patient, make suggestions on housekeeping and child rearing, and make sure the conditions of tenancy were followed, such as not using the house for any illegal or immoral purpose. Now continue west on Albion until you reach Yarrabin Street, only a few minutes down the road. With the war over and the first Commonwealth State Housing Agreement in 1945, the Housing Commission was finally able to crank out commission houses on a mass scale. Though unsuccessful, they planned to outbuild the private industry by 10,000 dwellings a year. They needed materials, labour, and efficient methods. With post-war shortages of just about everything, concrete became the material of choice. Concrete was abundant, easy to use, and houses could be prefabricated in panels using the design of T.W. Fowler. The Commission purchased an old munitions factory at Holmesglen for the task. The first concrete homes were put here on Albion, Yarrabin, and Weil streets. 58 concrete duplexes made up the Fowler estate, with over 3,000 poured by the Commission over the following decade. In the 50s, housing construction eventually caught up to demand. Menzies, re-elected, set out on a mission to turn Australia into a nation of homeowners. There was full employment by 1949, and just under 70% were homeowners by the early 60s. Though in working-class Brunswick, a majority still rented. The project of slum abolition was revived in 1952, fiercely opposed by tenants who were thrown out of homes deemed unfit for them. The state government copped a massive deficit, keeping commission homes at economic rents. But the ousting of Labour in 1955 saw a Liberal state government slam tenants with across-the-board rent hikes. The rent controls brought in during the war withered away as tenants left their fixed-rate agreements for new horizons. Still, some stayed in their forever affordable homes for decades. The housing shortage appeared solved, but the housing crisis, which forced some to pay and allowed others to profit on the so-called privilege of shelter, wasn't, and still isn't. The working class remained concentrated in pockets, hidden in high-rises, the menace of congestion in modern disguise. Just as before, the pendulum swings from investment to disinvestment in public housing. And renters keep on paying.